Some people dream up madcap schemes and sensibly don't do anything about them. This is a film about an exception of how a middle-aged Englishman and his particular dream took wing. With a little help from two friends, Milton raced this microlight plane halfway around the world from England to Australia. His flight was as much misadventure as adventure, but he got there in the end, and in a record time for a microlight. Here was an emotional man pitting himself against the elements, a man who wanted to be somebody.
I would like to have lived in a more heroic age, in an age when, instead of people calling it mad to do these things, they said, that was pretty good. I was doing what I think people should do every now and again, is to step out of the rut of life and the compromises of life and go and do something worth doing before you get too old.
After its epic flight, the aircraft, the Dalgety Flyer, certainly has a pensionable look about it, and in the wind an arthritic sound about it. If it had the power of speech, what stories would this microlight have to tell? What would it have to say about its pilot? We will come to the flight itself in due course, but to grasp how it came about, you need to know a little bit more about Milton. Ever since he was knee-high to a tiger moth, Milton has been obsessed by flying. His father was in the Royal Air Force, though he wasn't a pilot. Brian's adventures started on terra firma. In his 20s, he drove across the Sahara in an Austin 7 to meet his wife-to-be in Johannesburg. The car disintegrated en route.
When he arrived in Johannesburg, he was festooned with little bits. The number plate was sort of hung around his neck. The wheel hubs were up his arms like bracelets, and the gear knob, you know, for changing gear, we still have it. He won a scholarship to Cranwell, where he didn't really fit in because he really wanted to be Douglas Bader, and you know Douglas Bader doesn't work in peacetime, and they said to him, Milton, you know, you will either pass out first in your year or you will get chucked out first in your year, and he got chucked out first in his year.
Hang gliding has been an obsession since the 1970s. In 1977, Brian and a chum tried to hang glide the Channel, launching themselves from hot air balloons 20,000 feet up. The friend made it across, but sadly not Brian. He came down mid-channel and was picked up by a passing Soviet ship.
I really enjoyed the day, believe it or not. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, dropping out of the sky, falling into the water for an hour and a half, but I really did enjoy it. It's been a story to tell my grandchildren, really.
There were moments of triumph, a victory of machismo over American hang gliders, and a hang gliding award from the Queen. In 1978, an early experience of microlights, then little more than powered hang gliders, left Brian somewhat unnerved. The aircraft folded up like a wounded pterodactyl. Brian fell 250 feet. He was evidently lucky to survive. Two things helped cushion his fall. The field he landed in had been ploughed the day before, and there'd been overnight rain. Brian escaped with concussion and a few cuts and bruises, but understandably, he hesitated before messing about in a microlight again. What seduced Brian back was the Shadow microlight made in Suffolk in England. The first plane came off the production line in 1984. Basically, a microlight weighs less than 150 kilograms. The Shadow has a wingspan of 33 feet, an engine the size of a motorbike's, 440cc, a cruising speed of 70 miles an hour, and a range of about 500 miles.
He's always had this thing about people being like birds and travelling the world, migrating around the world like birds. And he felt, well, this is something I can do with a little teensy-weensy plane like this. You can fly the world in a thing.
Someone else, recognizing the improvements in microlight design, had a similar thought.
I mean, microlights were considered to be hang gliders with chainsaw motors, most notable for injuring people, and the idea of one of these flying to Australia was completely out the window. Couldn't be done. I mean, who's trying to kid who?
But Eve Jackson did do it, taking off in her Shadow microlight from Biggin Hill in Kent. After a sedate 15-month flight, she arrived in Sydney in the summer of 1987. She took her time, took in the scenery. She couldn't raise any sponsorship, had to mortgage her home, but she did get there first.
I thought it'd be nice for a man to come second in aviation for once, which of course Brian did, but there you go.
Eve Jackson's achievement seemed to give Brian the necessary kick. At the age of 45, he resigned his job as a television journalist and found himself a sponsor.
We'll do more than get through. We always do. You and me and Dalgety.
Dalgety, a food and agricultural group with Australian and British links, gave him £100,000. Look right, look left, and the novice pilot sallied out onto the runway and almost into an unrehearsed pas de deux with another aircraft. Could this be a portent of things to come? The Dalgety Flyer sensibly took evasive action on the grass verge.
The Australian government has decided to offer £10,000 for the first successful flight from London to Australia in a machine manned by Australians.
Brian would try to emulate the winners of the Great Air Race of 1919.
The competitors are required to supply their own machines and make their own necessary arrangements.
The race was won by a Vickers Vimy bomber, piloted and navigated by two Australian brothers, Ross and Keith Smith. Taking off from Hounslow in England, they reached Australia in under 30 days. Brian Milton determined to do the same. His plane was similar in range and performance to a Vickers Vimy, and he would try to reach Australia in time for the country's bicentennial celebrations. Brian assembled his team from the hang gliding fraternity. He would be the pilot himself. An ex-paratrooper, Mike Atkinson, would service the plane, following Milton on scheduled airliners, and Neil Hardiman, another hang gliding enthusiast, would coordinate the flight from London. It was time to open a new scrap album. December the 2nd, 1987, and the Royal Victoria Dock in London. Brian had asked Mrs. Thatcher to wave him off, but inexplicably there were other pressing engagements in her diary that day, and she couldn't make it.
Okay, to the right, please.
The pilot being a journalist himself, this was very much a media event. Brian and family snapped on a windy day. Neil Hardiman tried to start the engine.
To the right, sir. Right down the middle, please. To the left for the moment. You need to right. You've got your thumb now. It's a great adventure. It's a wheeze. Am I going to spend the rest of my life, just living normally and end up with a pension and the rest of it, or am I going to go and do what I'd always really wanted to do? And it was such a great idea, I just decided I must go for it. My wife said our stories were getting whiskery and old, and we needed some new ones too.
Well, I don't think he's mad. I think he's courageous. British people used to do things like that. We used to go off all over the world doing what I suppose is a mad thing, but we seem to have lost that thing, and Brian is putting some of that attitude back into what we're doing, so I'm really proud of him.
I hope he does it, because, it'll be great for him. He usually does things like this. He's mad.
So Milton and the Dalgety Flyer were off. Like the Smith brothers in 1919, Brian took a camera with him, and as it was for them, the weather wasn't particularly favourable.
The worst possible wind you could have was an easterly wind, and the worst type of wind was a very, very strong gale force easterly, and that is what I got. I looked at the average speed that I made the other day, just over 30 miles an hour. I was beaten by hovercrafts all the way across the channel. It was dreadful.
What with headwinds, cloud and rain, progress in Europe was slow, from Valence in France to Forlì in Italy. But having jumped the Alps, Brian's spirits had perked up a bit.
I had a very good day yesterday after 3 or 4 very bad days. And as usual, I wound up. I got the usual pre-flight nerves, but we've tested everything, and it all should work okay.
And it did, at least on that day. And Brian felt the race was on again.
And I thought, God, I can catch Ross Smith's ghost again. but the Greek islands down a little place called Kythera actually got me.
Kythera, just by Crete, has a single airstrip, which is notorious for strong winds. It was the wind, rather than terror, that made Brian's hair stand on end. The microlight was blown over on landing. He wasn't hurt, but the plane was damaged. Brian stood there as if he had slain a dragon. The aircraft was stripped down, fuselage, wings and nose. A Greek taverna served as a temporary hangar. This was a job for Mike Atkinson.
When I arrived, the plane was all in bits, and I sort of looked at it and thought, well, it's a wreck. And then I thought the only way to is go through it and see which bits I could repair. And I just sort of looked at each individual bit and said, I can repair that. And by the time I'd been through it all, we decided it was all repairable. It frightened Brian a bit at the time because the tailplane was all bent. And I said, well, I've got to see if it's straightened. And each bit I stood on actually broke. And Brian was pulling his hair out. And I said, well, it's no good if it won't straighten. We'd need new bits sent out from England. And so we had the new bits sent out. And then we just started gluing it back together, bit by piece. Basically, aerodite was the main glue, and I had some fiberglass and picking up bits of driftwood because the main wing was split right across the middle, and we had to clamp it back together. So it was bits of string and driftwood and wind it up with a Spanish windlass and then drive wedges in to glue it all back together.
After 6 days on Kythera, Brian was airborne again, crossing from Heraklion on Crete to Cairo. After the long sea crossing, Brian landed at night.
It's been the longest flight I've made so far. It's just been over 530 miles, which for an aircraft this size is very good.
And how was it flying over the sea?
You get frightened, then you get so frightened, then you can't get frightened anymore, so you just start getting bored. And then every now and again something happens that makes you frightened, and then you stop being frightened again, and you just carry on. And after 6 hours, I was really delighted to see Egypt.
The Dalgety Flyer, scratched but still in one piece, was put to bed for the night on the tarmac with a piece of string and a rock. Brian was dogged by fuel problems in the Middle East. He was given jet fuel by mistake at Aqaba in Jordan. Another drama was in the making.